17 Black R&B legends who were the worst jerks in history. They were worshipped as legends. Their voices shaped generations. Their music defined Black excellence. But what if the truth behind the spotlight is darker than we ever imagined? Behind the platinum records and standing ovations were secrets buried for decades, power abused, lines crossed, and reputations carefully protected. This isn't gossip. These are documented moments history tried to forget. On Black Excellence Legends, we don't rewrite history, we expose it. Stay with us because what you're about to hear may challenge everything you thought you knew about your idols. And before we begin, ask yourself one question. Can greatness exist without accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments. James Brown. James Brown was more than a performer. He was an engine of rhythm that reshaped modern music. Rising from extreme poverty in the segregated American South, Brown transformed personal hardship into a sound that would define funk, soul, and R&B for generations. By the mid-1960s, with explosive hits like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and I Got You, I Feel Good, he became known worldwide as the godfather of soul, influencing artists from Michael Jackson to Prince. His stage discipline was legendary. Rehearsals were brutal, mistakes were fined, and precision was non-negotiable. To audiences, that intensity looked like genius. To those closest to him, it often felt like fear. Behind the brilliance, James Brown lived a life marked by volatility. From the 1970s onward, his growing dependence on powerful stimulants worsened paranoia and erratic behavior. Court records and public testimony later confirmed repeated incidents of domestic violence, including accusations from his wife, Adriana Brown, who stated she was hospitalized multiple times due to physical abuse. These were not rumors. They were documented allegations that permanently complicated his legacy. The breaking point came on September 24, 1988. In Augusta, Georgia, Brown entered an insurance office carrying a shotgun, believing someone had used a private restroom reserved for him. What followed was a high-speed police chase across state lines, ending only after officers disabled his vehicle. He was convicted on multiple charges, including unlawful firearm possession and eluding law enforcement, and sentenced to 6 years in prison, serving about 2.5. James Brown returned to music after his release, but the image had changed. The same man who once symbolized Black pride in musical excellence had become a cautionary figure, proof that unmatched talent does not grant immunity from accountability. His influence remains immeasurable, but so does the damage left behind. James Brown's story forces an uncomfortable question. How do we honor cultural greatness while refusing to excuse the harm that followed it? Rick James. Rick James built his legend on excess. Bursting onto the music scene in the late 1970s and exploding through the 1980s, he fused funk, R&B, and raw sexuality into a sound that felt dangerous and irresistible. With anthems like Super Freak, Give It To Me Baby, and Cold Blooded, Rick James didn't just make hits. He embodied rebellion. His flamboyant fashion, unapologetic bravado, and aggressive stage presence turned him into a symbol of creative freedom at a time when boundaries were meant to be broken. But the same fearlessness that fueled his music also drove his self-destruction. As fame intensified, so did his dependence on cocaine, a habit he later admitted spiraled out of control. By the early 1990s, Rick James's private life had become chaotic and violent. In 1991, he and his partner Tanya Hijazi were arrested and later convicted for the prolonged assault and confinement of a woman inside his Los Angeles home. While awaiting trial, he was implicated in a second violent incident involving another woman at a West Hollywood hotel, confirming a pattern rather than a mistake. In 1993, Rick James was sentenced to prison, serving time that permanently altered public perception. The man once celebrated as funk's wild prophet now stood as a warning about unchecked power and addiction. When he returned to the public eye years later, the charisma remained, but the mystique was gone. His appearance on Chappelle's show revived interest in his music, yet even his humor carried an undertone of regret. Rick James died in 2004, leaving behind a catalog that still energizes dance floors worldwide. His story is not one of simple villainy or heroism, but of a gifted artist consumed by the very freedom he preached. In the end, Rick James proved that talent can electrify a generation, but without restraint, it can also burn everything around it. Al Green. Al Green's voice was once synonymous with devotion. In the early 1970s, his smooth, intimate delivery on songs like Let's Stay Together, Tired of Being Alone, and Love and Happiness made him the embodiment of tenderness in soul music. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Al Green projected vulnerability rather than dominance, becoming a symbol of romantic sincerity during a turbulent cultural era. Yet behind the velvet vocals lived a man struggling with contradiction. In October 1974, a shocking incident shattered his carefully cultivated image. At his Memphis home, his girlfriend Mary Woodson threw boiling water on him, causing severe burns. Moments later, she took her own life using a firearm found in the house. Investigations and diary entries later revealed a painful truth. Mary had discovered that Al Green had secretly married another woman, leaving her emotionally devastated. The tragedy forced the public to confront a reality they had never associated with his music. Al Green was not the flawless messenger of love he appeared to be, but a deeply flawed individual whose personal choices carried devastating consequences. In the aftermath, he withdrew from secular music and turned to religion, becoming a pastor and dedicating much of his life to gospel. This transformation was not a marketing move, but a response to trauma that permanently reshaped his path. Although Al Green eventually returned to recording R&B, the innocence was gone. His later work carried maturity, reflection, and restraint rather than idealized romance. Today, his legacy exists in two worlds, one defined by timeless love songs and another by a moment of truth that exposed how fragile public personas can be. Al Green's story reminds us that even the softest voices can hide unresolved conflict, and that beauty in art does not always reflect clarity in life. R. Kelly. For more than 2 decades, R. Kelly was one of the most commercially successful figures in modern R&B. As a songwriter, producer, and performer, he dominated radio and charts from the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, with songs like I Believe I Can Fly, Ignition Remix, and Step in the Name of Love. His work shaped the sound of contemporary R&B, blending gospel influence with pop accessibility, and he wrote or produced hits for numerous major artists. By the early 2000s, his influence was undeniable and deeply embedded in the industry. Yet parallel to that success were long-standing allegations that followed him quietly for years. Beginning in the late 1990s, journalists and insiders reported disturbing patterns involving young girls, secrecy, and manipulation. In 2002, a videotape surfaced showing criminal behavior involving a minor. Although he was acquitted in a 2008 trial due to insufficient evidence at the time, public scrutiny never fully disappeared. The turning point arrived in 2019, when the documentary series Surviving R. Kelly presented extensive testimony from multiple women who described systematic abuse, psychological control, and isolation over many years. Federal investigations soon followed. Prosecutors built cases using financial records, witness accounts, and digital evidence rather than celebrity rumor. In 2021 and 2022, R. Kelly was convicted on multiple federal charges, including racketeering and sex trafficking. He was sentenced to a combined total of 30 years in prison, marking one of the most significant criminal convictions of a major music figure in American history. Today, R. Kelly's catalog remains widely debated. His story represents a fundamental shift in how power, fame, and accountability are addressed in the entertainment world. Once celebrated for inspirational anthems, he now stands as a symbol of how artistic achievement cannot outweigh documented harm, and how silence, when prolonged, enables abuse rather than preventing it. Ike Turner. Ike Turner's place in music history is complex and deeply conflicted. As a pioneering bandleader, guitarist, and producer, he played a foundational role in shaping early rock and R&B. His 1951 recording, Rocket 88, is frequently cited by historians as one of the earliest rock and roll records ever released. Through sharp musical instincts and relentless drive, Ike Turner built a reputation as a disciplined architect of sound long before mainstream recognition arrived. That reputation expanded dramatically during the 1960s and early 1970s with the rise of Ike and Tina Turner, a duo whose live performances were among the most electrifying of their era. On stage, Ike controlled every detail: arrangements, timing, presentation, creating a tightly polished act that toured relentlessly and achieved international fame. Behind the curtain, however, that control took a far darker form. Tina Turner later documented years of physical abuse, intimidation, and emotional terror during their marriage. These accounts were not isolated claims. They were supported by witnesses, medical records, and Tina's autobiography. The defining moment came in 1976 when Tina fled their hotel room in Dallas with no money or possessions, ending the partnership both personally and professionally. Their divorce finalized soon after, with Tina relinquishing financial claims in exchange for freedom. Following the split, Ike Turner's career unraveled. Struggles with cocaine addiction, legal problems, and declining relevance replaced the authority he once wielded. Although he continued recording sporadically and attempted comebacks, public perception had shifted irreversibly. In 2007, Ike Turner died of a cocaine overdose at age 76. His musical contributions remain historically significant, but his name is inseparable from a legacy of abuse. Ike Turner's story stands as a reminder that innovation does not excuse cruelty, and that cultural influence can coexist with personal accountability. Bobby Womack. Bobby Womack was one of the most emotionally raw voices to emerge from classic soul and R&B. A gifted songwriter and guitarist, he began his career in the early 1960s and quickly earned the trust of Sam Cooke, who mentored him and believed Womack represented the future of soul music. That promise translated into a long career marked by unforgettable recordings such as Across 110th Street and If You Think You're Lonely Now, songs defined by honesty rather than polish. However, Womack's personal choices repeatedly overshadowed his musical gifts. In 1964, Sam Cooke was tragically killed, sending shockwaves through the music world. Only months later, Womack married Cooke's widow, Barbara Campbell. The decision was widely condemned and deeply damaged his public image, particularly within the Black community, where loyalty and respect carried enormous cultural weight. Radio stations pulled his records, and his reputation suffered a blow that never fully healed. The controversy intensified years later when it became public that Womack had an affair with Barbara's daughter, Linda Cooke, who was underage at the time. The revelation ended the marriage violently and permanently stained his credibility. While no criminal conviction followed, the moral fallout was severe. Industry support weakened, and Womack spent years navigating addiction, instability, and isolation. Despite these setbacks, Bobby Womack never disappeared musically. His later recordings carried a confessional tone, often reflecting regret, temptation, and emotional fatigue. Rather than reinventing himself as a victim, he leaned into vulnerability, allowing listeners to hear the consequences of his actions embedded in the music itself. Womack's legacy remains conflicted. He was undeniably talented, capable of turning personal turmoil into timeless soul records. Yet his story serves as a reminder that authenticity in art does not absolve destructive behavior. Bobby Womack is remembered not just for what he sang, but for how closely his music mirrored a life shaped by flawed decisions and lasting consequences. Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry stands as one of the most influential architects of modern popular music. Emerging in the 1950s, he fused rhythm and blues with sharp storytelling, youthful rebellion, and electric guitar riffs that would define rock and roll. Songs like Maybelline, Roll Over Beethoven, and Johnny Be Good didn't merely entertain, they reshaped the language of music, inspiring generations of artists across racial and cultural lines. Yet Berry's career was repeatedly interrupted by serious legal troubles that complicated his public standing. In 1959, he was arrested under the Mann Act for transporting a 14-year-old girl across state lines to work at his nightclub. He denied wrongdoing, but was convicted after a retrial and ultimately served time in federal prison during the early 1960s. The conviction stalled his momentum at the height of his influence, casting a long shadow over his achievements. Decades later, controversy resurfaced. In 1990, employees at a restaurant Berry owned discovered hidden cameras in women's restrooms. Subsequent investigations uncovered videotapes taken without consent. Although Berry avoided criminal conviction, he settled multiple civil lawsuits, paying significant financial damages. The incident permanently altered how many viewed him, shifting attention from innovation to misconduct. Despite these scandals, Chuck Berry continued performing well into old age, often receiving standing ovations from audiences who struggled to reconcile his musical importance with his personal actions. His riffs became the backbone of rock music, yet his legacy remains inseparable from ethical failure. Chuck Berry's story illustrates a difficult truth. Cultural impact does not erase accountability. He changed music forever, but history remembers him not only as a pioneer, it remembers the cost of separating artistic brilliance from personal responsibility. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye was a transformative figure in soul and R&B, an artist who shifted popular music from romance into reflection. Emerging from Motown in the early 1960s, Gaye initially found success as a smooth, romantic vocalist. However, his true impact arrived in 1971 with What's Going On, an album that challenged war, poverty, and systemic injustice. The record broke commercial expectations and redefined how deeply personal and political soul music could be, selling over 2 million copies in its first few years and earning lasting critical acclaim. Behind his artistic evolution, Marvin Gaye struggled with inner turmoil. Financial disputes, intense pressure from record executives, and ongoing battles with depression weighed heavily on him. By the late 1970s, his reliance on cocaine deepened feelings of paranoia and isolation. Those closest to him described a man increasingly withdrawn, emotionally volatile, and consumed by fear rather than fame. His marriage to Janice Hunter deteriorated under constant tension, arguments, and emotional instability. The final chapter of Gaye's life was tragically brief. On April 1, 1984, following a heated domestic dispute at his parents' home in Los Angeles, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his father. He was 44 years old. The incident stunned the music world, cutting short a career that had already reshaped modern R&B and socially conscious songwriting. Marvin Gaye's legacy endures not because of scandal, but because of courage. He used his voice to ask uncomfortable questions at a time when silence was safer. His personal life reflected pain rather than malice, and his music remains a bridge between vulnerability and truth. Marvin Gaye reminds us that sensitivity can be revolutionary, and that even those who speak for the world often struggle to save themselves. Sly Stone. Sly Stone represented a radical vision of unity in American music. As the leader of Sly and the Family Stone, he introduced one of the first major bands to feature men and women of multiple races performing together on equal footing. In the late 1960s, songs like Dance to the Music and Everyday People became anthems of inclusion, optimism, and social harmony, blending funk, soul, and rock into a sound that felt both joyful and confrontational. Yet as his influence grew, so did instability. By the early 1970s, Sly Stone's dependence on drugs, particularly cocaine and PCP, disrupted rehearsals, tours, and recordings. Performances became unpredictable, with shows starting hours late or being canceled altogether. Band members described an atmosphere of distrust and fear as communication collapsed and discipline vanished. What once symbolized togetherness slowly unraveled from within. A defining moment came in 1978 at the Oakland Coliseum. Thousands waited for Sly to appear, only to witness a disoriented figure stumble on stage, mumble incoherently, and leave without completing the performance. The incident marked a public breaking point. One by one, band members quit, contracts dissolved, and Sly's career entered a long decline. By the 2000s, reports emerged of Sly Stone living in near isolation, disconnected from the success he once embodied. Though he occasionally spoke of new music, the movement he helped create had passed without him at its center. His later years became a symbol of artistic burnout rather than innovation. Sly Stone's legacy remains paradoxical. He envisioned a world united by rhythm and equality, yet could not sustain the balance in his own life. His rise and fall reflect both the power and fragility of creative genius when left unprotected. George Clinton. George Clinton was a visionary who expanded the boundaries of R&B and funk into something theatrical, political, and unapologetically strange. As the creative force behind Parliament and Funkadelic, Clinton didn't just make music, he built an entire universe. From the late 1960s through the 1980s, his work blended funk grooves, psychedelic rock, and Afrofuturist imagery, producing influential records like Mothership Connection and Flashlight. His ideas reshaped black music, inspiring hip-hop, electronic music, and countless producers decades later. However, Clinton's leadership style became a source of deep conflict. As Parliament Funkadelic grew into a large collective, former members began accusing him of financial misconduct. By the late 1980s, musicians including Fuzzy Haskins and Jerome Bigfoot Braley publicly claimed that royalties were withheld, contracts were manipulated, and ownership of recordings was concentrated under Clinton's control. These disputes led to prolonged lawsuits that stretched across multiple states and dragged on for years. While Clinton denied wrongdoing, court documents and settlements revealed a pattern of financial chaos. Mounting legal fees, tax issues, and debt forced him to continue touring well into his later years, simply to stay afloat. Unlike artists undone by personal violence, Clinton's controversies centered on power and control. Who owned the music, who benefited from success, and who was left behind. George Clinton's influence on sound remains undeniable. His catalog continues to be sampled heavily, and his creative vision helped define funk as a cultural movement rather than a genre. Yet his story exposes a quieter truth about the music industry. Innovation can coexist with exploitation. Clinton stands as both a genius architect of modern black music and a reminder that leadership without transparency often leaves lasting fractures behind. Ron Isley. Ron Isley's voice became synonymous with sophistication in R&B. As the lead singer of the Isley Brothers, he helped shape popular music across 6 decades, adapting effortlessly from gospel-rooted soul to funk, quiet storm R&B, and even hip-hop collaborations. Songs like For the Love of You, Between the Sheets, and Contagious established him as a master of emotional restraint, smooth, controlled, and timeless. Few vocalists managed longevity with such consistency. Behind the elegance, however, Ron Isley faced serious financial and legal consequences. In the early 2000s, federal authorities uncovered years of unpaid taxes and improper financial reporting. Despite continued success and a lavish public image, records showed millions of dollars in tax debt owed to the U.S. government. In 2006, Ron Isley was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The case shocked fans who associated Isley with refinement and stability rather than scandal. Unlike many of his contemporaries, his downfall was not tied to violence or addiction, but to financial mismanagement and avoidance. During his incarceration, the Isley brothers' momentum slowed, and Ron's absence underscored how dependent the group's identity was on his presence. After his release, Ron Isley returned to music with renewed focus, collaborating with younger artists and embracing a quieter, reflective phase of his career. His comeback was less about dominance and more about endurance. Today, his legacy carries both admiration and caution, proof that grace on stage does not guarantee discipline off it. Ron Isley's story reminds audiences that even the most polished figures can stumble, and that accountability, once enforced, reshapes how legacies are remembered rather than erased. Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was one of the most influential entertainers in modern history, a figure whose impact transcended genre, race, and geography. Rising to fame as a child prodigy with the Jackson 5, he evolved into a global phenomenon during the 1980s, redefining pop and R&B with albums like Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad. Thriller alone sold over 60 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling album of all time. His precision, innovation, and visual storytelling changed how music was performed, marketed, and consumed. Yet with unprecedented fame came relentless scrutiny. Beginning in 1993, Michael Jackson faced allegations of inappropriate behavior with minors, accusations that fractured public opinion. That year, a civil lawsuit was filed and later settled out of court for $23 million, without an admission of guilt. The case marked a turning point, permanently altering how the world viewed him. A decade later, in 2005, Jackson stood trial again in California. After months of testimony and global media attention, he was acquitted on all criminal charges. Despite the legal outcome, the psychological toll was evident. Jackson became increasingly reclusive, physically fragile, and disconnected from the industry he once dominated. Financial pressures mounted as legal costs and lifestyle expenses drained his resources. Though he continued working, the joyful spontaneity that once defined him was replaced by caution and exhaustion. Michael Jackson died in 2009 at age 50 from acute propofol intoxication, ruled a homicide due to medical negligence. His death sparked worldwide mourning and reopened unresolved debates about fame, innocence, and responsibility. Today, his legacy exists in tension, celebrated for unparalleled artistic achievement, yet permanently shadowed by controversy. Michael Jackson's story reflects the dangers of absolute celebrity, where admiration, isolation, and accusation collide in ways no individual can fully withstand. David Ruffin. David Ruffin was a voice that helped define Motown's golden era. As the lead singer of the Temptations during their most successful years, Ruffin delivered emotionally charged performances that turned songs like My Girl into timeless classics. His gritty yet tender vocal style brought depth and personality to the group, helping elevate them from a polished vocal act into cultural icons of 1960s soul music. Success, however, intensified Ruffin's darker impulses. By the late 1960s, his growing ego disrupted group dynamics. He demanded top billing, arrived late to performances, and occasionally failed to appear at all. Behind the scenes, substance abuse worsened his instability, straining relationships with bandmates and management. In 1968, after repeated violations of contracts and conduct expectations, Ruffin was fired from the Temptations, a dramatic fall from the spotlight he once commanded. Ruffin's personal life was equally turbulent. Multiple accounts described volatile behavior in relationships, including incidents of jealousy and physical aggression. His longtime partner, singer Tammy Terrell, reportedly suffered emotional and physical harm during their time together, adding further weight to concerns about his conduct. These issues followed him into his solo career, which, though occasionally successful, never matched his earlier prominence. In the years that followed, Ruffin drifted between brief revivals and prolonged decline, struggling with addiction and financial instability. He died in 1991 at age 50 from a drug-related overdose, alone and far removed from the acclaim he once enjoyed. David Ruffin's legacy is inseparable from contradiction. He possessed a voice capable of expressing love and longing with unmatched sincerity, yet his inability to control his own impulses ultimately cost him his place in history's spotlight. His story stands as a cautionary tale about talent without discipline, brilliant, unforgettable, and tragically unfinished. Prince was a singular force in modern music, an artist who refused to be categorized or controlled. From the late 1970s through the 1990s, he wrote, produced, and performed with a level of autonomy rarely seen in the industry. Albums such as 1999, Purple Rain, and Sign of the Times showcase not only musical versatility, but an obsessive attention to detail. Prince played multiple instruments fluently, layered complex arrangements alone in the studio, and challenged norms around gender, sexuality, and artistic ownership. That same intensity, however, defined his working relationships. Prince demanded absolute precision and loyalty from collaborators. Musicians who toured or recorded with him often described exhausting rehearsal schedules, sudden dismissals, and an atmosphere where disagreement was not welcomed. He viewed creative compromise as weakness, believing that singular vision was essential to greatness. This mindset produced brilliance, but also isolation. In the early 1990s, conflict with Warner Brothers Records brought these tensions into public view. Prince accused the label of restricting his creative output and controlling his masters. In protest, he changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol and appeared in public with the word slave written on his face. The move divided public opinion, but highlighted a critical issue: artist ownership in a corporate industry. Years later, many musicians would cite Prince as ahead of his time in this fight. Prince died suddenly in 2016 from an accidental opioid overdose, leaving behind a vast, unreleased catalog and unresolved questions about his guarded personal life. His legacy is not one of scandal, but of uncompromising control. Prince proved that artistic freedom can produce revolutionary work, yet his story also shows the cost of standing entirely alone. He remains remembered as a genius who bent music to his will, even when it meant pushing everyone else away. Bobby Brown. Bobby Brown emerged in the late 1980s as the embodiment of youthful rebellion in R&B. As a former member of New Edition, he broke away to establish a solo identity built on swagger, street energy, and emotional volatility. His 1988 album, Don't Be Cruel, became a commercial phenomenon, producing multiple hit singles and helping define the sound of New Jack Swing. At his peak, Bobby Brown represented confidence without restraint. Offstage, that lack of restraint followed him relentlessly. As fame intensified, Brown struggled with substance abuse, impulsive behavior, and legal trouble. His highly publicized marriage to Whitney Houston magnified scrutiny. What initially appeared as a glamorous union slowly revealed deep dysfunction. Police reports, court records, and later family testimony described a relationship marked by addiction, volatility, and episodes of domestic violence. In 2003, Brown was arrested in Georgia following a violent incident involving Houston. Legal problems accumulated over the years, including arrests for assault, drug possession, and driving-related offenses. As his career momentum slowed, public sympathy eroded. Bobby Brown became less associated with musical innovation and more with cautionary headlines. His talent was never in question, but discipline consistently failed him. In later years, Brown spoke openly about regret, loss, and accountability, particularly following the deaths of Whitney Houston and their daughter. His attempts at recovery and reflection have reshaped public perception, though not erased the past. Bobby Brown's story illustrates how success without stability can collapse inward. He remains a figure defined by both influence and consequence, proof that charisma can launch a career, but character determines whether it survives. Otis Redding Jr. Living under a legendary name can be a burden few are prepared to carry. Otis Redding Jr., the son of soul icon Otis Redding, grew up surrounded by a legacy that defined an era of American music. While his father's voice became immortal through songs that symbolized love and pain, Otis Jr. faced a quieter, far more complicated struggle, one shaped by expectation, comparison, and inner conflict. Unlike his father, Otis Redding Jr. never fully stepped into the national spotlight. Though he possessed musical ability and connections within the industry, his career remained limited, largely confined to smaller circles. According to accounts later shared by relatives, his personal life was marked by instability, resentment, and self-destructive behavior. Family members alleged that he struggled with alcohol abuse and anger issues, which affected his relationships at home. These claims, while not part of public court cases, painted a picture of a man wrestling with unresolved pressure rather than public ambition. What made his story particularly tragic was the emotional weight of legacy. Comparisons to his father followed him constantly, and those close to him suggested that he viewed other soul legends as rivals rather than inspirations. This mindset, rooted in insecurity rather than malice, reportedly fueled resentment and isolation. Instead of building his own identity, Otis Jr. appeared trapped in the shadow of a name too powerful to escape. Otis Redding Jr. died in 2007, far from the acclaim that surrounded his father's memory. His life serves as a reminder that fame does not only affect those who earn it, but also those who inherit its shadow. Sometimes, the most painful stories in music history are not about fallen stars, but about those who never found a way out of the light cast by greatness. Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy Pendergrass was once the embodiment of power and desire in 1970s R&B. As the lead singer of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, and later as a solo artist, his commanding baritone and intense stage presence made him one of the most celebrated performers of his era. Songs like Close the Door and Turn Off the Lights transformed him into a symbol of confidence, masculinity, and emotional dominance, especially admired by female audiences across America. Behind the image, however, was a man driven by control and excess. Industry insiders and former associates describe patterns of manipulation in his personal relationships, suggesting that fame amplified a need for dominance rather than intimacy. These behaviors remained largely private until a single night changed everything. On March 18, 1982, Teddy Pendergrass was involved in a devastating car crash in Philadelphia. Driving his Rolls-Royce, he lost control and struck a tree, leaving him paralyzed from the chest down. The passenger in the vehicle, later identified as a transgender woman named Tanika Watson, became the focus of intense media attention. In a cultural climate filled with prejudice, speculation overshadowed compassion, and Pendergrass chose silence rather than public explanation. The accident ended his career as a live performer, but not his influence. Pendergrass returned to recording and eventually performed again from a wheelchair, displaying resilience few expected. Yet the mystique that once surrounded him never fully recovered. Questions about his private life lingered, not because of confirmed crimes, but because of secrecy and unresolved narratives. Teddy Pendergrass died in 2010. His legacy remains layered, a voice that defined sensual R&B, a life reshaped by tragedy, and a reminder that fame can magnify not only talent, but the consequences of the choices made behind closed doors. So now that you know the full story, the question isn't whether they were talented. That was never in doubt. The real question is harder. Should legendary art excuse personal damage? Can we separate the music that healed millions from the actions that hurt those closest to them? Or does true excellence demand both genius and integrity? These stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths about fame, power, and silence. At Black Excellence Legends, we believe history should be honest, even when it's painful. Now it's your turn. Do these revelations change how you see these icons, or will the music always matter more? Let us know in the comments.